First up, we have a mystery you may have heard of before. That of Oakey Albert Kite Jr. Blame It on Jorge did a great deep dive into this cold case, and I highly recommend you check his video on it out. But right now, I'm gonna have a stab at it myself. Oakey, or Al as he preferred to be called, was known for being a kind and easygoing guy. The type of man that had no enemies to speak of. Even his ex-wife, Gail, whom he'd divorced in 2002, remained good friends with him long after they had separated, and Al went out of his way to keep a good relationship with his stepdaughter, Julie. In early 2004, Al was living the carefree bachelor's lifestyle. Despite having lost his wife, stepdaughter, and previous job just 2 years prior, the 53-year-old was now doing very well for himself once again. He'd purchased a 2-story townhouse in Aurora, Colorado, and had landed a new job at the consulting firm Carter Douglas. During a work function, he also happened to meet a charming woman named Linda Angelopoulos. The pair quickly hit it off and began a casual romance, one which quickly blossomed into something more serious. Now with a new partner, a new job, and newfound happiness, there was just one thing Al still needed: a new tenant. As mentioned, Al's townhouse in Aurora was 2 stories. He lived on the top floor and rented out the lower one to bring in a little extra cash each month. In May 2004, his previous tenant had moved out, so Al was on the hunt for a new housemate to fill his empty room. He put up ads in the University of Colorado's library, and on May 19th, someone responded. A guy who went by the name Robert Cooper. Well, whoever this Robert Cooper was, he sounded desperate for a place to stay, and wanted to move in as quickly as possible. He told Al over the phone that he could have the security deposit and first month's rent for him that same day in order to secure the lease. Mr. Cooper also mentioned that he worked at Wells Fargo, said that he had just been transferred from the East Coast, hence why he needed a place to stay. Robert Cooper ticked all the boxes and sounded like a decent enough guy, so Al agreed to rent him the room. Perhaps, he thought, this could be the start of a new friendship. At some point within the next 3 days, Al's girlfriend, Linda, came to the townhouse to pay him a visit. She just so happened to arrive while Al was showing Robert Cooper around the downstairs apartment. Al asked Linda if she'd like to meet the new tenant. She said of course she would, but she had to use the bathroom first. In the short space of time that Linda was inside the bathroom, Cooper told Al that he had forgotten about an important appointment he had and hastily made for the exit. As Linda stepped out of the bathroom, she only caught the briefest glimpse of Cooper's back as he left. According to both Linda and several other neighbours, he was a well-dressed man who appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, of medium height and build, with dark, curly hair. Most notably, Linda said that he walked with a limp and carried a cane. Neither she nor Al thought much about Robert Cooper's speedy exit. Maybe he really did have a prior engagement, or maybe he had some social anxiety problems and didn't want to meet Linda for some reason. Either way, it wasn't a big deal. As long as the guy kept up with the rent, he could come and go as he pleased. A few days later, on May 22nd, Al dropped Linda off at the airport. She was taking a week-long trip to Virginia Beach, while Al finalized the contract with Mr. Cooper and helped him settle in. Cooper said he needed some assistance with moving an armchair down the stairs, or something like that, and Al, being a nice guy, offered to lend a hand. Linda's plane landed safely later that day, and she called Al at 3:30 p.m. to tell him that she had arrived. But there was something off about the phone call. Al wasn't his usual, happy-go-lucky self. Instead, he was quiet, distracted, maybe even uncomfortable. Figuring that he was just busy helping Cooper move in, Linda wished him a good weekend, and they both exchanged I love yous before hanging up. Linda had no idea that she would never speak to Al again. Nor would anyone else for that matter, except perhaps for the man who took his life. On May 24th, just 2 days after Linda's departure, Al's absence at work was noticed by his boss. That was slightly alarming. Al was a diligent and punctual worker. He wouldn't have just taken a day off without notifying the company. The boss tried to call Al, but got no response. To be on the safe side, he called up Al's sister, Barbara, and asked if she could check up on him. Barbara didn't live in Colorado, so she, in turn, called up the local authorities. Within minutes, officers were on their way to Al's home to conduct a welfare check. They knocked on his door, but nobody answered. Realizing that the door had been left unlocked, the officers slowly entered and took a look around, hoping to find some trace of Al inside. Well, they found more than just a trace. At the bottom of the stairs to the basement, they found Al, hogtied and lying face down in a puddle of his own blood. He had been struck in the back of the head with a blunt object while walking down the stairs. But it wasn't the strike that killed him. While incapacitated at the bottom of the stairs, his attacker tied up his arms and legs behind his back, and then proceeded to torture him for hours. The soles of his feet were extremely bruised and swollen, having been repeatedly beaten with a steel honing rod, a form of punishment known as falaka. Sharp blades from his own kitchen had been inserted into his ears, down through his shoulders, and even into the spaces right above his eyes. The unusual way in which Al had been bound made it impossible for him to move. All he could do was endure the pain. Finally, whoever had done this to him had finished him off with 22 stabs to the chest, head, and neck. The final blows were so ferocious that Al's head was nearly detached from his own body. Sickeningly, after taking Al's life, the perp then made himself at home. He cleaned up the scene, ate food from Al's fridge, wore Al's clothes, took a shower in his bathroom, and even slept in his bed, something very reminiscent of the Japanese Setagaya family massacre case. It's believed that Cooper may have stayed in Al's home for more than a full day after slaying him. Perhaps the perp wanted to know what it felt like to be his victim. Perhaps he just got a thrill out of remaining at the scene. Perhaps taking Al's life wasn't enough, and he wanted to take his privacy too. Whatever was going through the guy's head, it was clear to the investigators that they weren't dealing with an ordinary killer. Whoever this man was, he hadn't known Al personally, but had still taken great satisfaction in his work, and he had to have been planning this for a very long time. The lead investigator on the case, Detective Thomas Sobieski, believes that Al was struck in the head while helping his new tenant, Robert Cooper, move in. This Robert Cooper was the obvious suspect. Now all the authorities had to do was track him down. To begin with, they found the crumpled up rental contract between Cooper and Al in the kitchen bin. The contract contained all of Cooper's personal information, but obviously it had all been made up. His social security number belonged to an 80-year-old woman who lived in Indiana. His address was for an elementary school in Denver. His reference phone number was from an Aurora retirement village, and the name Robert Cooper was of course an alias. No one with that name worked at Wells Fargo or had moved to the area. Because this guy had chosen to target Al, not because he knew him, but because he had an apartment to rent, they didn't really have a lot to work with. But they did have something. When the perp finally left the townhouse, he took Al's debit card and truck keys with him. He then drove Al's vehicle to a nearby ATM, where he withdrew $1,000 of his victim's hard-earned cash. While doing so, the ATM's inbuilt camera took several pictures of the killer, his face hidden behind a ski mask. Strangely, Al had a lot more savings in his checking account, and the perp could have taken a much heftier sum if he wanted to, but for some reason only took $1,000. Then again, money clearly wasn't this guy's motive. He hadn't tormented Al and then taken his life for financial gain. No, he'd done it simply because he could. After withdrawing the money, Cooper again returned to Al's townhouse, removed all the blades he had inserted into Al, and then placed them in the kitchen sink, along with the steel honing rod. He poured bleach all over them, as well as down the shower drain to remove any DNA evidence he left behind. Finally, he walked out the front door and vanished into the night. To this day, nobody knows who Robert Cooper really was, or why he did what he did. He had been careful not to leave behind any trace of his identity, even in the lead-up to the slaying. The only evidence he had left behind was his phone number, which he had used to contact Al in the first place, but it turned out that he had actually been using a burner phone. That very phone was found in downtown Denver, and investigators were able to work out which 7-Eleven Cooper had purchased it from, one close to the University of Colorado's library. But Cooper had done his homework. He had waited 30 days to activate his burner phone. Guess how long that 7-Eleven kept their CCTV footage before deleting it? Bingo. Exactly 30 days. Cooper was also smart enough not to call anyone else using that phone. So, unfortunately, this seemingly vital piece of evidence was, in reality, worthless. Mr. Cooper had been disturbingly methodical. As the investigators would come to learn, just before Al's untimely slaughter, numerous other landlords in Aurora had left ads at the University of Colorado's library, looking for tenants to rent their empty rooms. Many of them had been contacted by a man calling himself Robert Cooper. Several of them even met with him. One landlord described him as a well-dressed man who walked without a limp. Another landlord, who happened to be familiar with European dialects, said that the man spoke with a distinctly Romanian accent. According to her, Cooper spent a lot of time examining her windows. Both landlords agreed that he gave off a creepy vibe, with one of them saying that he made the hair on the back of her neck stand up, and because of that, they both turned him away. Well, their intuitions likely saved their lives, and if they hadn't followed their gut instincts, we'd probably be talking about one of their deaths here, instead of Al's. But Al liked to think the best of people. Always had. And that cost him everything. As it stands, the case of Al Kite remains unsolved to this very day, and the true identity of Robert Cooper remains shrouded in mystery. But the audacity of his actions, the amount of effort he put into finding his victim, the time he invested in planning this whole thing, the efficiency with which he pulled it off, the confidence he displayed by remaining at the scene, and the joy he clearly got from his work. Well, it all makes me wonder whether this really was just a one-time deal, or whether Al was just another victim on this killer's sick resume. A lot of internet sleuths believe that's the case, and have tried to link Robert Cooper to other killers who were caught trying to use their victims' bank cards. Guys like Roy Charles Waller, who also like to disguise his identity. Others have suggested the infamous Azrael Keys. His MO was very similar to that of the perp in this case, and the ATM photos certainly bear a striking resemblance to him. Still, to date, no definitive connections have been drawn. But there is one piece of good news. A small amount of DNA belonging to an unknown male was uncovered on the basement stairs at Al's house. This was run through the authorities' database, and though no matches have ever turned up, the DNA did reveal that this unknown male was of Southeast European descent, and using advances in forensic technology, composite artists were recently able to create this image of his face. This 3D figure is Robert Cooper, back then and now. With developments like this still being made more than a decade after the incident, perhaps one day this incredibly sinister figure will be brought to justice, and this rabbit hole finally filled in. With a little luck, the FBI might be able to map his family tree and find him that way in the near future. Until then, all we can do is shudder at the fact that people like Robert Cooper actually exist, and that, on any given day, they could choose to target you, not because you wronged them, but just for the thrill of it. If you've checked out a lot of Unsolved Mysteries content before, it can almost end up feeling like you're listening to movie plots, rather than things that have happened to real, ordinary people like you and me. But, as this next case proves, any one of us could unwillingly become the star of our own murder mystery. The year was 2005. The subject of this story? Todd Geib, your average 22-year-old, living in the small community of Casnovia, Michigan. With a good job at Hager Distribution, an active social life, and a loving family, the future seemed bright for Todd. But sadly, that future was about to be taken away from him by a sinister force. June 11th, 2005 was a Saturday, and for a young and outgoing guy like Todd, that meant a night out with his buddies. Now, Todd and his friends were a very close group. Not surprising, since Casnovia only had a population of 314 at the time. He left the house that he shared with his cousin at 7:30 p.m. and went to meet his friends at the Half Moon Bar and Grill. They ate dinner together, and at 9:30 set off to an orchard party just off a dirt road, basically in the middle of nowhere, but still very close to where Todd was staying with his cousin. Most of the youngsters living in and around the area went to this event, about 100 people in total. One person who wasn't attending was Todd's designated driver. She dropped Todd and the others off at the orchard and promised to pick them all up later. Straight away, the event seemed like it was going to be a rager. There was a keg and a bonfire, and by all accounts, the atmosphere was electric. A little too electric. At approximately 12:45 a.m., a fight broke out between a few of the local guys, and almost erupted into a full brawl. This prompted Todd, who was still in a sober state of mind, to leave the party very abruptly. It's unclear whether he was frightened about the brawl, or whether he was just tired and wanted to get some rest. But either way, he said a quick goodbye to his friends and told them he was going to walk home. He set off on foot and disappeared from the party into the darkness. Since he only lived about a mile away and hadn't drunk too much, his pals weren't too worried about him making the journey by himself. But almost as soon as he left the orchard, Todd made a series of odd phone calls that were concerning to say the least. At 12:47 a.m., just 2 minutes after leaving the orchard, Todd called up his close friend, the woman who had dropped him off. She answered, and Todd simply said, "I've had enough," before the line cut out. It's not known whether he meant he had had enough of the event and wanted to be picked up, or if he meant he had had enough generally. In another call, which he made at 12:51, he told that same friend, "I'm in a field," before the line cut out once again. His friend immediately called him back, but all she could hear on the other end of the line was either the rush of wind or heavy breathing. Phone records show that Todd kept trying to call his friend back for the next 5 minutes, but the calls wouldn't go through. That was the last contact anyone had with Todd Geib. He never made it home that night. While making the mile-long journey back to his cousin's house, Todd seemingly fell off the face of the earth and vanished entirely. For the next 3 weeks, a search effort involving 1,500 officers and volunteers worked day and night to help find Todd. Planes scoured the area from above, and thermal imaging devices were used to try and locate him. In the latter days of the search, sniffer dogs were brought in to track Todd's movements. They picked up on his scent and followed it from the orchard along a dirt road and up into a field. It appeared that after leaving the party, Todd was indeed walking in the right direction back home. But strangely, the dogs lost his scent as soon as they reached the main paved road. The road that would have led Todd straight to his cousin's house. The final stretch of his journey. But why did his scent simply vanish when he reached it? Did somebody pick him up after all? On July 2nd, Todd was found. But to everyone's dismay, the search for him didn't have a happy ending. A local couple found his body in Ovidal Lake, very close to where his scent disappeared, smack bang in the middle of the search area. But he wasn't submerged in the lake. He was standing upright, his head and shoulders above the water's surface. It almost looked like he was still alive and was just treading water. But there were no ripples, and the lake was completely still. At first, the wife thought that he was a beaver, but when the couple realized what they were actually looking at, they immediately called the authorities. Investigators arrived and removed Todd from the lake. He was fully clothed, and his wallet was still in his pocket. There were no noticeable injuries on his body, and since he had a large amount of alcohol in his system, they theorized that Todd must have left the party, then decided to go for a drunken swim, and ultimately drowned. In their eyes, it was a classic case of misadventure, and they closed the case almost immediately. But their conclusion just didn't seem to make sense for several reasons. Firstly, how had Todd's body gone undetected in that lake for 3 weeks when he was so obviously standing in the middle of it? A group of 1,500 had thoroughly searched that area. It seems strange that nobody spotted him. Secondly, most people who drown are found bobbing face down in the water, but the chilling way in which Todd was standing, it almost appeared as if somebody had placed him there. It also doesn't make sense that Todd would go swimming fully clothed. Not to mention, when he left the orchard, everybody noted how clear Todd's head was, like he hadn't had too many drinks at all. In response to these questions, a team of independent investigators examined Todd's remains, and what they discovered was truly disturbing. Although Todd had been missing for 3 weeks, he had only been dead for 2 to 5 days. His body was in too fresh a condition, and there was hardly any insect activity or algae build-up on his body. Even stranger, they found absolutely no water in his lungs, none whatsoever, which completely discredited the police's conclusion that he had drowned, and strongly indicated that he had been killed on land and then placed in the water. As a result of these findings, this independent team conducted a number of tests with pig carcasses. They placed these carcasses in the lake to examine the rate at which they decomposed. Pigs are anatomically very similar to humans, so they wanted to see if, after 3 weeks, their carcasses were in a similar condition to Todd's body. As expected, a huge number of insects colonized the pigs. On top of that, there was also a large amount of bloating, foaming, algae and slime buildup, all things that weren't present on Todd. There was no way he had been in the water for all those weeks, and he had almost certainly been the victim of foul play. This new team theorized that when Todd made it to the paved road, he was actually picked up by one or more people, who then held him on land for a period of time before taking his life and eerily placing him in the water. They even put forward a possible group of suspects, namely the Smiley Face Killers, a group you have likely heard of before. Their existence remains unverified, but many people, including seasoned investigators, believe they're a shadowy group of organized killers who target young, successful, popular men, and almost always dump their remains in rivers, canals, and lakes, often leaving behind their graffiti signature close to the scene, a crudely sprayed smiley face. According to some witnesses, one such smiley face was found spray-painted on a tree near Ovidal Lake, though I can't seem to find any official reports confirming that. The team speculated that the Smileys forced Todd to consume a lethal dose of amitriptyline and desipramine, 2 prescription substances which were also found in his system, and which Todd himself hadn't been prescribed. Despite the independent team's findings, the authorities stuck with their ruling, and said Todd had accidentally perished while night swimming, even though there was no water in his lungs. It's entirely possible that Todd's demise was a complete accident, but the official version of events ignores too much evidence to be taken seriously, and the quest for definitive answers persists to this day. Todd's mother has tried for years to get her son's case reopened, but even though all the evidence points towards foul play, the cops still refuse to take another look at it. Remember, Todd lived in a very small community of only 314 people. If somebody did take his life, it doesn't seem like it would be hard to find the person responsible. That, combined with the authorities refusing to reopen their investigation, has led some people to believe there's a cover-up going on. If that's the case, then the only questions left to answer are who are the authorities protecting, and why? We'll end things with a mystery from Germany, that of Ursula Herrmann, the girl in the box. Ursula was a sweet and intelligent 10-year-old who loved nothing more than gymnastics and playing the piano. In 1981, she lived in the small village of Schondorf, Bavaria, with her parents and brother Michael. On September 15th, the siblings both attended an after-school piano lesson, after which Ursula took her bike and rode to a gymnastics class which she always attended with her cousin. Being close friends, Ursula went back to her cousin's house in the neighbouring village of Ecking, and, at 7:30 PM, began the short cycle back to her own home. Thing is, she never made it. When 8 PM rolled around, Ursula's mother called her cousin's house and asked if her daughter would be leaving soon. The cousin's mother told her that Ursula had left 30 minutes earlier. The ride should have only taken 5 to 10 minutes, so immediately, alarm bells started ringing. The two households immediately started searching the areas between Schondorf and Ecking, but there was no sign of Ursula anywhere. Her parents went straight to the police station, and before long, a huge-scale search effort was underway. Almost the entire population of both villages were out looking for Ursula, but their efforts were all in vain. 2 days later, on September 17th, Ursula's parents received a bizarre phone call from an unknown person. When the phone rang, they both jumped for the receiver, hoping against hope that someone was calling with information about their daughter's whereabouts. For the first few seconds of the call though, all they heard on the other end of the line was silence. Then, an eerie radio jingle began to play. They didn't know what to make of it. After receiving 3 identical calls, the authorities began tapping the family phone lines. 3 days after that first call, a mysterious letter arrived in the mail, made from letters cut out from books. It read as follows: "We have taken your daughter. If you ever want to see her alive again, pay 2 million Deutschmarks as a ransom." 2 million Deutschmarks worked out to be roughly $1.2 million, a huge sum which the Herrmann family simply didn't have. Still, they were going to agree to pay and worry about how later. But how were they supposed to tell the Perps that they were willing to pay? Well, as it turns out, the note had arrived much later than the Perps had anticipated. It was supposed to have been read before the first phone call was made, but due to postal delays, had arrived after. The cryptic radio jingles that they played over the phone were supposed to elicit a yes or no response with regards to the ransom payment, but without the note telling them that, there was no way Ursula's parents could have known. Well, the next time the phone rang, Ursula's mother confirmed that they would indeed pay. Then, on Monday the 21st, a final letter arrived, this one detailing the payment instructions. The money must be made in 100 Deutschmark bills. Ursula's father should deliver the packed suitcase. The date and location will be communicated later. He must drive a yellow Fiat 600, no faster than 90 kilometers an hour. Over the course of the next few days, the Herrmanns reached out to everyone in their community for support, and as a result, were able to raise the 2 million Deutschmarks they needed to get their daughter back. Now all they had to do was wait for the Perps to tell them when and where to meet. But those instructions never came. After 2 weeks with no contact, search efforts for Ursula reignited. Hundreds of officers, tens of sniffer dogs, and many people from the villages combed the woods. This time, they used metal rods to search beneath the leaves and foliage. Finally, 19 long days after Ursula had first disappeared, a huge discovery was made. Using a metal rod, one of the officers found something hidden beneath the forest floor. A green box, shallowly buried in the earth. Inside was the lifeless body of Ursula Herrmann. Everyone was devastated. Ursula's parents had agreed to pay the ransom, so why had the Perps so callously taken her life? Well, as it would turn out, they likely hadn't meant to. To begin with, Ursula's remains were examined. It was clear that she hadn't put up much of a fight, had likely been sedated when she was first taken, and hadn't tried to escape. As for the box she was entombed in, it had actually been designed to keep Ursula both alive and entertained. There was food and water inside it, along with books, a small bulb, a radio, a toilet bucket, and a ventilation pipe which went up to the surface so she could breathe. But just like how they hadn't anticipated their ransom note being delivered late, they had also failed to consider air circulation. Despite designing the box to keep Ursula alive, she'd ultimately perished due to a lack of oxygen. The ventilation pipe simply didn't allow for enough air exchange, and in all likelihood, she had suffocated just a few hours after being placed in the box. The authorities quickly realized that the box was far too big and heavy for one person to have moved alone, meaning there were at least 2 perps involved. They were quickly tipped off that a man named Werner Mazurek may have been one of those responsible. Mazurek lived next door to Ursula and her family, and was known to be in a lot of debt, so he certainly had a motive. Thing is, he also had an alibi. He claimed that at the time Ursula disappeared, he was playing the board game Risk with his wife and her friends, something which they all confirmed. He was taken in for questioning anyway, but released after several days. After his release, an acquaintance of his, Klaus Pfaffinger, told the authorities that Mazurek had asked him to dig a hole out in the woods not long before Ursula vanished. Thing is, when the authorities asked Pfaffinger to take them to the hole, he was unable to do so, and recanted his statement. Perhaps he was lying for attention. Perhaps he wanted revenge on Mazurek for something. Or perhaps he was involved in some way. In 2007, the statute of limitations on the case was fast approaching. By that point, Pfaffinger had passed away, and the only living suspect was Werner Mazurek. With nothing left to go on, and the case about to freeze over forever, the authorities raided Mazurek's house and found a Grundig model TK-248 tape recorder, something which he could have used to play the jingle all those years ago. They used that tape recorder, along with Pfaffinger's past statement, to take Mazurek and his wife to trial. In all honesty, it wasn't a lot to go on, with all of this evidence being circumstantial. There was no DNA evidence or fingerprints to speak of. Even Ursula's own brother, Michael, didn't believe that the couple were responsible. Still, against all odds, Werner Mazurek was found guilty and sentenced to lifelong imprisonment. His wife was acquitted. To this day, Mazurek remains behind bars, though there are many who consider him to be an innocent man, most notably Michael Herrmann. In 2016, Michael was able to get Mazurek a retrial, this time with strong evidence that he wasn't the one responsible for what happened to Ursula. Sound experts had analysed the tape recorder and said there was no way to prove it was the one that had played the jingles. A language expert examined the ransom note and concluded that it had to have been made by someone who spoke broken German, someone who wasn't a native speaker like Mazurek. Still, the court refused to overturn his conviction. The final update in this case happened just last year, nearly 30 years after Ursula's life was taken. In March 2021, top German media houses received an anonymous letter in the mail. This still unidentified person confessed that he and his friends were the ones responsible for taking Ursula's life back when they were high school students in 1981, and that Mazurek was an innocent man. It remains unknown whether this confession was legit or not, but with this case now officially closed, it's unlikely anyone's going to look into it. A huge thank you to all of my supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, especially my biggest supporters. That One Guy Thomas, Jessie Jug, Alex Greensall, Alicia Jagels, Anicra, Azrael Warakai, Beatrice Matarazzo, Charlie Lackey, Colin Monsma, Connor Louthan, Crawford K. McDonald, Expand Dong, Gina Valera, Gracearchie, Infamous-senpapi, Kiegan Eady, Leonardo Martinez, Myra Lancaster, Monica Mendoza, Nadine, Natalie Escobedo, Peter Logdraj, Philip Westra, Procupidine Natter, Sarah Ramirez, Taylor&Monica Gruenk, The Only Dorita, Zane, Ms. Crypto, Damien Bennett, The Deck of Cards, Lydia Glassley, and Hamish K. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. It really helps the channel out. Be sure to smash that like button or I'll smash you, and you'll be hearing from me again very soon. Until then, you will stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.